Propaganda has long been a powerful tool for shaping public opinion, influencing international discourse, and justifying military actions. In Russia's war against Ukraine, propaganda has been a central instrument for creating narratives that legitimize aggression, undermine democracy, and manipulate perceptions both domestically and internationally. This episode is a recording of a public event about propaganda held by a Central European University in Vienna. The speakers of the event were Teresa Marques, a philosopher of language, associate professor at the philosophy department of the University of Barcelona, Juliane Fürst, a historian, professor at the Department of Historical Studies at Central European University, and myself, Volodymyr Yermolenko, a Ukrainian philosopher, president of PEN Ukraine and chief editor of UkraineWorld. The event was moderated by Fabio Lampert, postdoctoral researcher at University of Vienna. It was organized by the Knowledge in Crisis, a cluster of excellence supported by the Austrian Science Fund. I appreciate a lot the possibility to publish this conversation on our podcast. Let me remind you that UkraineWorld is run by Internews Ukraine, one of the country's leading media NGOs. You can support our work at Patreon. Your support is crucial as we increasingly rely on crowdfunding, and even a small monthly contribution can make a significant difference. You can also help fund our regular volunteer missions to Ukraine's frontline areas where we deliver aid to both soldiers and civilians, primarily by providing vehicles for the military and books for local communities. You can support these trips via PayPal. You will find the links in the description of this episode. So let's begin.
Thank you all for coming. Before presenting our speakers, I'll start us off with a little story. It was already morning when a grenade rocked the house. The explosion set off a fire. Then came gunshots. Flames tore through the rooms, consuming the furniture, family photographs, documents. Everything was burning. Irina was hiding beside her husband, Ole. He shouted at the soldiers not to shoot. "Why are you hiding?" the soldiers yelled. "Don't you see we came to liberate you? We came here to die. Our wives are waiting for us back home. And you started this war. You elected this Nazi government. So where are the Nazis?" "There are no Nazis here," Irina replied. "We are just simple people." The soldiers ordered Ole to take off his jacket, his sweater, his shirt, to check for military tattoos. But he had none. He had never served. He was just a welder. They took him outside and shot him in the head. When Irina saw his body, she screamed, "Shoot me." Irina's story is not just one of personal loss. It lays bare the terrifying power of propaganda, its ability to distort reality, dehumanize victims, and enable sheer violence under the guise of liberation. Weeks later, speaking to journalists about what the Russian army had done in her town of Bucha, Irina said, "You tell this story to everyone. You show how they've liberated us. They've liberated us from everything. We have nothing now." Propaganda has long been a powerful force for shaping public opinion and even justifying violence. In the context of Russia's war against Ukraine, it is not an afterthought. It is a central instrument for legitimizing aggression while manipulating perceptions at home and abroad. So this evening's panel will explore how propaganda works, its nature, its mechanisms, its historical roots, and how it has evolved in the digital age. Russian propaganda, with its vast scale, state backing, and strategic purpose, has been used not only to justify the war against Ukraine, but also to undermine democratic institutions in other places. Its most infamous example remains the Kremlin-backed disinformation campaign that sought to influence the 2016 US presidential election in favor of Donald Trump, who, according to my calculation, still has 1,350 days remaining in office. So I'm counting. Episodes like this have made Russian propaganda grow in focus, not only for analysts and political commentators on geopolitics and on television, but also within academia, where it has become a subject of study in its own right. Using Russian propaganda as our central case study this evening, We'll explore how narratives are built, how they spread, and how they are weaponized in times of war and political conflict. So to do this, we'll have a truly distinguished group of panelists. Now, as I mentioned before, the three of you are just so productive that I'll only summarize some of what you've done so that we still have some minutes to talk. I'll start with Teresa here. So Teresa Marques is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Barcelona. In Spain, she is a philosopher of language, but has interests in metaethics, epistemology, and feminist and social philosophy. She has published several academic articles on slurs, hate speech, propaganda, the expression of emotions in language, and other topics, and has edited and co-edited academic volumes such as the book Shifting Concepts, The Philosophy and Psychology of Conceptual Variability, published by Oxford University Press. Juliane Fürst is a historian of Soviet and post-Soviet history, specializing in youth cultures, dissent, and socialist subjectivities. She is professor of modern history at Central European University, CEU, and leads the Communism and Society Department at the Leibniz Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam, in Germany. Juliane edited a volume of the Cambridge History of Communism and published books such as Stalin's Last Generation, Flowers Through Concrete, both by Oxford University Press. Finally, Volodymyr Yermolenko is a philosopher, writer, and journalist, serving as editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld and analytics director at Internews Ukraine. He is president of PEN Ukraine and associate professor at the Kyiv Mohyla Academy. He has authored multiple award-winning books and contributes regularly to international media outlets such as The Economist, Financial Times, The New York Times, Le Monde, and others. Volodymyr also hosts the podcasts Explaining Ukraine and Thinking in Dark Times. Welcome, the three of you. We'll talk for a little over an hour, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience. So let's start today with Teresa and some questions about propaganda more generally. So Teresa, let's start with a broad view. Although propaganda isn't a new subject, people have been writing on this topic for a while, there's been renewed philosophical interest in political philosophy of language. One of your recent papers, for instance, is titled The Defectiveness of Propaganda. So could you tell us how philosophers approach this topic and how you yourself like to think about, or perhaps even define, propaganda?
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and for the occasion to be on this very nice panel. I'm sure I'll learn quite a bit. So how philosophers have thought of propaganda mainly since the beginning of the 20th century, well, philosophers and other theorists, sociologists, etc., the increase in interest in propaganda as a political form of mass communication sort of became more salient with also the increase in means of mass communication, from more people being able to read newspapers to the existence of the radio. And so it also started to become much more prominent in the first beginning of the 20th century because of the great historical shifts that were taking place. The topic itself was not sort of center interest through a good part of the 20th century, probably after the 1950s. Not so many people wrote about it, perhaps with the exception of Chomsky and a few other people. But with the first election of Donald Trump, it seemed that philosophers across the board were like, or also perhaps even before this, perhaps with Brexit, people were opening their eyes to how did this happen? We didn't think it was possible, and so people were really shocked, and there's been an increased interest. And so even people who are not really political philosophers say, so political philosophers, and if you think people like Hannah Arendt, wrote about totalitarianism and how authoritarians use propaganda to reach power, but not epistemologists or philosophers of language or philosophers of mind specifically. There seems to be a very narrow and specific interest. So people have started to think about what propaganda is and how to define it in more recent years. It's a difficult topic to understand because it can be used, and in different languages it means slightly different things. So in Spanish, Portuguese, or Italian, it's a much broader term that covers anything from advertising to political campaigning that is not necessarily propagandistic, just promotion of a political party. But in the way that in my recent work that you mentioned, we think that it's useful for the role also that historians and sociologists and others want to have in their understanding of propaganda. It's useful to have a better understanding of propaganda that captures the specifically political sense of the word that we think is more relevant. And so there are paradigmatic cases of propaganda that we think includes, say, Nazi propaganda or Soviet propaganda, and also we think includes modern day forms of propaganda that take advantage of social media and other kinds of platforms. And so what is crucial in the proposal in our paper that we think is a good definition is that propaganda is somehow epistemically defective means of mass communication that is promoted on behalf of political or social cause or organization of movement to influence large parts of the public or society. But what is really essential there is that it involves this notion of epistemically defectiveness. And this is a notion that we have further developed from works of other authors like Cheryl Tuttle-Ross that had a preliminary definition that was going in this direction. And by epistemically defectiveness, we understand this as including many things that is not necessarily just falsehood. So there might be propaganda that doesn't say anything false, for instance. It just manages to emit a lot of really relevant information. There might be propaganda that seems to be giving reasons, and that the reasons that for acting in a certain way, and the reasons might seem plausible or sensible or really hard to rebuff or to reject. But the kind of thing that they are alluding to is a kind of conceptual framing that is really problematic. Or even cases in which it's nothing that was said, it's nothing that was omitted, but rather there are things that are being presupposed in a given kind of act or communicative act, let's put it like that, that might be presupposing something that's problematic. So there are examples like in Rwanda, for instance, leading up to the genocide of the Tutsis, Mugesera was the political leader well in advance before the genocide took place. He would say things like, do not let yourself be invaded, right? Where the idea that you can refer, what the problem there was, and this was not even a description, this was a directive, like you're telling you what you should do, which is not to let yourself be invaded, but this is presupposing that the target of the presumed invaders are your co-citizens, like also citizens of Rwanda that are the Tutsis, right? So this is something that is being presupposed, but it's not being said, and that is problematic. So the notion of defectiveness is very broad. It can be manifested in many different ways, and we think it is an essential part of the propaganda. I think.
Juliane, you've written extensively about the Soviet Union, and propaganda was central to Soviet governance. Some historians even call the Soviet Union a propaganda state. So before moving to Russia, let's start by focusing a bit on its precursor state. How important is the history of Soviet propaganda? How crucial was propaganda for the Soviet Union itself? And finally, as a historian, how do you understand propaganda?
Also, first of all, thank you for inviting me. There's a joke always going around historians that there's nothing scarier than a literary scholars conference, but I think philosophy might even top that. So as a historian, and actually in preparation of this talk, I was thinking a bit of how do we distinguish between propaganda and neighboring fields, especially if we work on states that have used the term propaganda not only without negative connotations, but indeed with positive connotations. And I would say the main difference historically for what the difference between propaganda and other flows of information is that if you have information transfer, as in news, the transfer of the actual information is at the center, and therefore you have a high ideal of transferring something that is accurate, which you might not succeed, but at least that is the vision. While for propaganda, actually, the vision is not necessarily about the transfer of information, but about the mobilization. And you get that already if you look at where is propaganda as a term first used in the Soviet context, which of course is also the first socialist context. And very quickly, one of the first departments established by the Communist Party in then first Russia, then later on the Soviet Union was indeed the Department for Propaganda and Agitation. And therefore the two terms, propaganda and agitation, always go together. Propaganda is about mobilizing people, mobilizing opinions, mobilizing sentiments. And for communism to succeed, this mobilization of people is absolutely crucial. It isn't really about convincing somebody about the truth or giving accurate information. It is about convincing people for the truthfulness of the cause. And propaganda is one of the tools in doing this mobilization. And therefore, both socialist and fascist states have completely openly called their ministries, their departments, propaganda. And therefore, of course, it is central to the Soviet Union and to the communist utopia that was promised by the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, and it had different manifestations. So in the 1920s, many artists, writers, of all forms, designers, put voluntarily their work under the umbrella of propaganda, of convincing people, of mobilizing people for this, what was then considered a beautiful cause of communism. However, the downside, of course, is since the central cause of mobilization, the accuracy or the truthfulness of the information conveyed was very secondary. And while it could be truthful, accurate, it could also not be, or it could be leaving things out. So I guess this is where your epistolary defectiveness comes in. And the defectiveness, because it was in the service of a larger cause, was deemed excusable. And interestingly, because, I mean, the talk is called Propaganda in the Times of War, the moment war in its larger sort of framework started appearing, propaganda became more and more menacing. And I'm thinking here actually not in terms, I mean, obviously, the Second World War, as it is called in the Soviet Union, the Great Fatherland War, it was a high spot of propaganda because the Soviet Union was fighting for its survival. It actually really starts earlier. It starts with the war on the peasantry, with decolonization, which was preceded by a huge propaganda effort to demonize and dehumanize peasants who wanted to keep holding their soil. They were called kulaks. Some of them were indeed richer parents, some others were actually not so rich. And then proceeds with the war on perceived enemies of the people, labeled enemies of the people, therefore also dehumanized. And then goes into this huge mobilization, obviously, in the times of war, when it seemed like there was suddenly a cause that was even more worthy than the communist cause, the sheer survival of the state. But the vocabulary that was developed in these times is now something that is coming back to haunt us. And I mean, I suspect there will be maybe follow-on questions for that, so I won't go into that whole fascism, fascist Nazis, denazification. It's all vocabulary that was coined in the course of the Second World War, and also very importantly in the period after the Second World War, when the war was over, but the hunting of enemies wasn't. And the vocabulary, however, didn't ever really change.
Volodymyr, you've written extensively about Russian disinformation targeting Ukraine. In Words and Wars, for instance, you and your co-authors describe Ukraine as being on the front lines of countering Kremlin propaganda. This was already years ago. As a philosopher, first, how do you approach this concept more generally? And we'll get to Russia propaganda later specifically.
Okay, so more I'm very happy to be here. So it's more very general statement because I'm a CU graduate, but from Budapest from 2003. Well, a long time ago. So I think that there are several concepts in which in which people describe propaganda which are misleading. One of the concepts is the concept of disinformation. Why? Because disinformation is only part of the problem, and my colleagues already said that. So the aim of the propaganda is not to lie. The aim of the propaganda is not to deceive you.
What is the aim? We can come back a little bit later, but I would just follow up on what Teresa said. Like, what if propaganda uses truth? One of the examples I remember is when there were Yellow Jackets protests in France. What RT did, former Russia Today, the major Russian propaganda tool, was just to show the protests without any comment. Why did so you cannot actually say that this was a lie, but I think the key thing why I'm still calling it propaganda was the intention. So the Russians are not using the word propaganda very much. They're using the word information and psychological war. And here two concepts are very important: the concept of war and the concept of psychological. Another term that they use as well is also used in Ukraine is the reflexive control. And you never know what is about reflex or it's about reflection, but I think it's both. So it's an idea that you try to control people from within. You try to control people not as objects, but as subjects. And it's a very interesting philosophical question. So I really, I love, Fabio, how you opened this panel, because you clearly made the link between the actual war and the information war. Why it is important? Because if we look at the way how Russians frame everything, like different fields of reality, be it information or trade or religion, they started framing it from, let's say, the beginning of Putin's era, maybe earlier, in terms of war. So everything that Europeans were framing in terms of peace, like what is information? It's just sharing knowledge, right? It's and therefore you have all these concepts of, you know, information without borders, etc. Take trade, for example. Take energy. Whatever Europeans were framing in terms of peace, like cooperation between nations, whatever, Russians were trading in terms of war. And this, what people are call it weaponization of information and other stuff. I think it's very important for us to understand that there is a clear link. If you start a war, let's say information war, you will end up in the real war very quickly. If you start a war as a trade war, you will end up in real war very quickly. So I think this is something that people misunderstood about Russian intentions. And coming back to the Yellow Jackets example, the intention here is very important, because what makes a difference, a very, very difficult difference between, let's say, critical journalism and information psychological war. Both of them will show problems of society, right? But the critical journalism will try to show this problem in order to help you cope with this. And the information psychological war will try to show you this problem in order to destroy you from within. So basically the idea of showing only the Yellow Jacket process was not to help French people solve their problems, but to destroy them from within. And here, coming back to this mobilization topic, it's very important, this mobilization element. But another element is demobilization. Like if you have a war with your enemy, what Russia is now doing very much in Ukraine is trying to demobilize us, is trying to say, okay, don't go to the front line, because it's all the war of your government, whatever. Go against your authorities, etc., etc. So this is the first point: do not confuse propaganda with disinformation. Let's think in other terms. Maybe the term of information and psychological war is actually the accurate one. Another thing, and I will finish on that, and I think it's a very big, profound philosophical problem, is that actually is a question about reality and virtuality. Because what I'm, as a philosopher, look at the history of European philosophy in the 20th century, regardless of different topics there, I think the key motive was how we disentangle ideas from reality, in a sense that ideas should be critical of reality. So we should kind of make a distance between ideas and reality, and therefore it's all about this critical thinking that it comes like we have critical theory, we have critical theories of this and that, and this is very important. So for example, the goal of institutions like these, like universities, is to have a critical view of reality, is to say that reality is imperfect, we need to think about it, we need to improve it. But the idea of reality was very important. And this is the whole our civilization is based upon the idea that there is reality. I think what Russians was starting doing it very long time ago, not in the 20th century, not in the 21st century. Earlier, I can think about this. Is how we actually, how we not adapt ourselves to reality, but how we invent ideas that will actually totally reform the reality. So how can we win over the reality? That was the task of many Russian intellectuals, be it religious intellectuals or post-religious intellectuals. It's not the idea how we adapt to this reality or reform this reality according to our ideas, is how we invent something in our fantasy and then adapt, change the reality in a way that it is adaptable to our fantasy. Like take the communism, for example. It's amazing how Russia was trying to build a communism, the dictatorship of proletariat and everything in a country where proletariat didn't exist, right? So you need to invent this fantasy and then change the reality. And the reality was, for example, the peasants that were living in Ukraine or Kazakhstan or other places that didn't have a collectivist mentality at all. And therefore you need to destroy them and kill them and annihilate it to adapt this reality to the fantasy you invented. And paradoxically, this makes a certain parallel between the Russian propaganda and what is happening now in the United States. I've just come from the United States, and I can tell you that, well, it was probably one of the diseases of the American society is that we actually create some fantasy and then we believe in this fantasy regardless of the reality on the ground. But now it's just is being realized to such a way that we see actually White House publishing AI pictures with Trump as a Jedi or whatever else, or as a pope. Recently it was a Jedi. So it's
with
really
a red lightsaber.
Sorry?
With a red lightsaber.
Yeah. So I'm just finishing on that. It's a point, and I think it's a very important point, and I want us to reflect upon it. It's a point that no matter how crazy our virtuality seems to us, we will make it stronger than the reality, and we will make reality obey to our virtuality. This is Trumpism, and this is Putinism, and the Soviet propaganda as well. And I think we Europeans, and lots of other people in the world. I don't, of course, make like big judgments about like some exclusivity of Europe or whatever. No, but I think in Europe in 20th century we had certain idea that no, it's very, very dangerous. When you invent this virtuality and try to destroy reality for this virtuality, it's very, very dangerous. I don't know if we will cope with this, with both Putinism and Trumpism in this way, but I think that this is what I see as a core problem.
Yeah, I just, at some point I thought you were literally defining socialist realism, because that was the doctrine. Socialist realism wasn't about depicting reality, but reality how it ought to be. And that is literally what 70 years was the entire cultural output of the Soviet Union, and then for 40 years for most socialist states in Eastern Europe was under the doctrine of socialist realism. And this is why the 1980s are in many ways so revolutionary, because at the end of the 1980s, the socialist world broke with this idea of socialist realism, and suddenly you had all these people depicting reality as it was, and it broke the system. But of course, as historians, we grapple with another problem of the reality insofar as we were very enthralled in the 1960s with French philosophers and basically deconstructed our whole profession, and now have a problem of how do we reconcile this idea that every event is constructed, every notion is constructed, and yet we have a certain reality we have to grapple with. Yes.
So no, not everything is constructed. And even things that are constructed are not up for grabs. So you can say money is a social construction, or inflation is a social kind. It's something that only exists because there's the world is out there. But even things that are socially constructed don't depend on our will. We can't just control them at ease, and let alone other things. And yeah.
No, but there has been, and of course, in many ways, it was. I mean, I remember that when I was trained, I was still trained by very empirical historians, and everything was fact. And then suddenly somebody came and said, "But actually, you can look at this from a completely different viewpoint, and it will tell you something different, or there will be a meaning behind." And it was very intoxicating. So it is a methodological problem of reconciling the fact that everything that is factual also has several other meanings, with the idea that there is something immovable in the world that has indeed happened. It's a terminology we haven't employed because it was so hard to wean ourselves off it.
I think that's true for journalism as well, that there are people, I remember giving talks to students in journalism schools, and all their professors, who probably were trained after the 60s, saying, no, but it's all relative, and we think, not only is that not true, or everything is socially constructed, no, not only is that not true, you as a journalist, you have the duty to give the information that is the best evidence you have, or supported by the best evidence of the thing that you have more reason to think is right. And the failure to do that will undermine trust in you as journalists. And I think that part of what we're living through now is a result of this, of people losing trust in journalism because it seems that everything is up for grabs, everything can be invented, and so someone else gives you a better story about what reality is like, and so they go and vote for someone who thinks is a pope or something. It's part of the problem, part of the consequences.
Should we continue to jump in?
Do you have a...
Yeah, but we can remove from that, because I have also my thoughts about social construction, but it will be long. I mean, it will long thoughts. But just I think it's very like perfect problem. And another problem can be also like a journalist comes and says, well, we had it in 2014, like. Many Western journalists were coming, Westerners, like a specialist in communication, was saying, just respond to Russian propaganda with facts. It doesn't work like that, because people don't think in terms of facts. People think in terms of stories, identities, and all of that. But I think it's what is important is, of course, to maintain the notion of fact. That is very important, because otherwise you're just going to social realism or social surrealism, right? Which was actually was. But I think constructivism is important from the other side, not in statements like everybody is constructed, but in statements like probably my view of this reality is constructed. So it leads us into the direction that probably my view of reality is a little bit far from reality, or it doesn't match the reality. It's probably just a map. And in these things, if you apply it to yourself, to your vision, I think it's still very pertinent. You know, it creates this distance between les mots et les choses, as Foucault said, right? Between the words and the things, which are very important to maintain the critical thinking. What I'm trying to say is that, well, Putin and Trump are not constructivists. They're something else, you know. They're just implode the reality and fantasies together.
I'll ask a question. Otherwise, I'm going to run out of questions because you're responding them. This is great. So I want to connect with what you were saying, Volodymyr, and also what you, Juliane, and you, Teresa, were mentioning before about meaning and really about the weaponization of language and how language can be manipulated. So Teresa, you wrote about this. You wrote a paper called Amelioration versus Perversion, and you discuss concepts like dangerous speech and meaning perversion. And you even give the example of the Holodomor in Ukraine. So the Holodomor was a mass famine. That was a consequence of Stalin's 5-year plan, basically where we get the 2 + 2 = 5 that got famous with Orwell later on. And could you walk us through those concepts and how they could be applicable also in the Ukraine scenario?
Okay, so the notion... So words have meaning, like the word propaganda has a meaning. In fact, it has several related meanings. It comes from the church and the Counter-Reformation. Words like democracies have meanings. Words like republic have meanings. But then you have some states or countries claim to be democratic or republican, and they're nothing but. So they're definitely none of that. And they still continue to want to claim that we are a democratic country. Say Eastern Germany had in the name democratic. Democratic was part of its name, and it was not because people didn't really have many alternatives from which to choose as their form of government for several decades. So what happens in these cases, and why do people claim that there are different types of meaning? So the word democracy has a certain etymology, the way that it tends to be addressed, and the way and different democracies that exist in the world. For instance, they can be democracies in slightly different ways. The way they count votes might vary. So there are different ways of descriptively describing countries that count as democratic in that they meet a certain list of criteria. But the word democracy is polysemous, so it has various related meanings, and one of these meanings associated to it is an evaluative one. So it's something that is a desirable or a good form of government. And so one wants to cling to being called democratic and forcing others to recognize, to call you or recognize you as democratic, even though descriptively you meet none of the particular criteria that democracies actually have. But by doing that, you're forcing people to see some value in the kind of state that you have. And you seem very serious when you say that you're democratic, right? So this illustrates by saying that something that is not democratic, but calling it democratic, is a kind of a meaning perversion. So what did I, when I came up with that, what did I mean by that? So imagine that we're in the situation of having different kinds of democracies. In some you have one person, one vote. In others you have different kinds of representations. In others you have first past the post. So you have all these different kinds of democracies, and you can disagree about which one of them. In some you have some limits, so the majority cannot vote to discriminate against a minor group, whereas in other countries you just have whoever gets the most votes is the democracy. So you have different ways of thinking about what democracy is. You might think like, oh, we could improve the concept of democracy. And so some political philosophers have discussed like, what is the best notion of democracy that we could have? And then we have other people that are not really interested in trying to find the best concept of democracy, but that they're interested in exploring some evaluative or effective association with the word, and then misapply it to things that really don't merit that positive or negative association. So you might say that someone is an enemy of the people, even though the person is perfectly peaceful citizen who has never harmed anyone. But by being named that, you've now allowed a mistreatment of that person as if they were an enemy of the people. So that the person does not deserve that treatment. So this is a perversion of what an enemy, the word enemy means. So the person is not an enemy, but you've made them, you made them one, you made them someone who should be treated as an enemy. Likewise for democracy, like you have this state, not democratic at all, by having a bunch of other countries also treating you as if you were a democracy, you're forcing something onto the world stage, like you're forcing some kind of recognition. And that is a perversion of the meaning of the word, because the word really does not mean, you really don't deserve to be positively valued as a democratic state when you lack any of the properties that democracies strive to achieve and to have. So that's sort of an illustration of what I meant by the meaning perversion, and it's really difficult to resist meaning perversions. So because when someone says, so if I say something that is false, like it's a brilliant sunny day today, and you say, no, Teresa, it's not, you just contradict me, right? But if I say, this is a wonderful, we're going to have this beautiful democratic election coming up next week in which you are going to go and pick the paper that has already my name there, and you're going to vote for me, and all of you have to go and vote for me. If I say, well, I'm not going to participate, because what do I say in that response? It's not that it's false. What I'm going to say is, what I can say in the case of a meaning perversion is something, how can you be against democracy? Don't you value democracies? How can you be undemocratic? So this is part of the idea, is that the questioning, if you question the process that is really not a democracy, they can always resort to the attacking you for not having the value And that's part of the mechanism that I thought was involved in the way that meaning perversions operate.
Great. So, Juliane, I think this connects really well with your article that you wrote on Putin's rhetoric in the war, denazifying Ukraine. So, tell us about that article and the historical examples that you have.
Well, the article was written really very close after the full-scale invasion, but I want to pick up on what you said about the meaning perversions, because I think it fits very well. As a historian, basically what we do, and in fact one of the achievements of the French philosophers of the 1960s is to give us the linguistic turn. And that means that we look in many ways at the process of meaning perversion through a historical lens. We call it contextualization, that the word is used and understood by people very much depending on the context of time, place, history. And that's what I basically employed in this article, and which was very much written really under the kind of shock of what was happening and the rhetoric that was coming out of Russia. And my main point was that one could be forgiven for thinking we're in a time warp because there was a very contemporary war going on, and yet the vocabulary was straight out of the Second World War, with fascists and denazification and filtration camps and that made me think, because in the end, of course, even though the Soviet Union has been dead for 30 years, all the main actors in Russia are very much products of the socialist Soviet system. And many Russians, because there wasn't as much of a decisive break in Russia compared to other countries of the post-Soviet space, Soviet socialization and therefore Soviet lexica has still a lot of valence, and nothing has more valence than this word fascist and Nazi, which of course is very much rooted in the context of the Second World War, when it was very real. And as somebody who has worked on propaganda during the Second World War, I noticed then that initially in 1941 the term was very much German invaders. That was the term used, and then it was very quickly, already in about a year or two into the war, changed to fascists, which was partly practical because there were more than German invaders, there were Italians, there were Romanians, etc. But it was also, it pushed that fight onto an ideological sphere. And in a way, and I think actually Russia is still married to this concept, these are not actual national wars, these are ideological wars. Now it's wars of civilizations. The Huntington book was a huge success in Russia. It really spoke to people in the 90s. And even people of the subcultural milieu constantly quote Huntington and the fight of civilizations back to you. And in a way, the sort of the fascist against the communist ideology, that was the concept in which the Soviet Union wanted to see the Second World War being fought. It was more than about a geographical invasion. It was about these ideological big concepts, very much forgetting that, of course, between 1939 and 1941 they were allied with the fascists. And the term then became a sort of kind of term on its own and very much associated with especially Western Ukraine, but Ukrainians overall, because Ukraine and the Baltic states put up a long time post-war struggle against a Soviet occupation with a guerrilla war in the name of groups which had indeed at some point been allied with the Germans and had fascist tendencies. There's no doubt that in the ideology of a Stepan Bandera you find fascist elements. But it became this term which basically had a life long after the last Banderovцы had actually been killed, and the sort of idea that somehow on the borders of the empire there are these former collaborators. The term fascist has an immediate reaction to the Russian ear. So the resurrection of this term after the full-scale invasion immediately signaled that this was not about actual practical gain of territory or strategic territory, as it had been still sort of with the annexation of the Crimea. It was still like, yeah, this is for our fleet. There was still an element of that. This really was all about this ideological worldview, and very quickly, of course, there was all this rhetoric about we are at war with NATO, we are at war with the West. This is about our survival as as a civilization, as a cultural space, and all of this was embedded in this word fascist. Yeah, that's and that of course that it's a perversion of it's a meaning perversion of fascist, because fascist is very much a specific term, also historically anchored in the mid-century Italy, Germany, bit of Bohemia, Spain, yes. And to decipher what precisely then actually, for example, even the Bandera movement, even the Ukrainian independence movement, while having certain elements that could be attributed to fascism, it would be a huge historical debate if indeed that would be fascism. But it then became this sort of catch-all term because it had this effect, this emotive response.
So I'm this is great. So, I'm not sure how things are in the German-speaking world, but in Spain and in Portugal, and I think in all the south of Europe, partly, Portugal and Spain, partly because we did live through, Spain more fascist and Portugal sort of quasi-fascist regimes for decades. And the democracy is so recent, it's basically 50 years old, and in Portugal and in Spain, there are lots of people who were anti-fascist resistant, and the parties on the left were also very much on anti-fascist. But the left-wing parties nowadays, they seem to repeat a lot of this sort of Russian. I'm still to meet someone on the left who rejects the Russian propaganda, and and in particular, the word fascist and Nazi seems to have replaced what before would have been sort of evil. Just anything that is fascist or Nazi is like the ultimate evil paradigms. And in fact, there's a former political leader of a Spanish left-wing party avoids any kind of questions, including, did you receive money from Iran? Oh, you're a fascist journalist, and throws the mic away. Right, so this is, and he does this in every single meeting. He speaks really loudly, accuses people of being fascist, and it's really effective. And it's very hard to talk with anyone after someone has been accused of being a fascist. It's almost like, how can you be against democracy? Like, how can you support a fascist? Like, not supporting a, right? It's you're put on your back foot because it's really hard to respond after the accusation has taken place. And I see this across. I've seen this in Greece recently, that people say, well, they were allied with the Nazis. Like, hold on a second. So were a lot of Greeks, There were lots of Greeks who were allied with the Nazis. And you don't say that, oh, it's fine for Turkey to take over, right? This is not an excuse, right? So, but it's really hard to respond once this association has taken over, because it's like, oh, evil, right? So you cannot respond rationally once the association with evil takes place.
There's also, of course, a follow-on, because if one looks at the policies of the Soviet Union, how to deal with people who lived on occupied territory, with returning POWs, with people who were forced to work in Germany in factories, it was all of them were a stigmatized group. So it didn't actually even matter if you were involved in any kind of resistance struggle. The mere fact that you had contact with the fascist enemy, basically by association, made you a fascist. And it's something which is, I think, in Russia, very few people will remember that. But for years, these people who lived, even just were on occupied territory, and of course we have to remember Ukraine really was occupied for about 3 years, while most of the bits of Russia that were occupied were mostly only occupied for a few months. So that the brunt of the stigma was carried mostly by the Western peripheries. And it ruined their lives, and it made them a person under suspicion. And even though then, of course, after the 70s, the policies became to relax, that stigma lived on, and it only had to be reignited. And that is, of course, what Putin, and not only Putin, I mean, I must say Putin has a whole propaganda apparatus, a whole willing media landscape at his disposal. They reignited that latent associations with that occupied territory that has never been able to redeem. And that is, of course, also something which is this sort of, from a fascist, you cannot redeem. You cannot change, you cannot redeem, you cannot change. It's like kulak. You're once a kulak, always a kulak, and then you deserve extermination. In the end, it's an exterministic rhetoric.
Volodymyr, so to come back to Russia's to the Russian Federation propaganda against Ukraine. So, what role does this information war play in the beginning of the war and in sustaining the war?
Well, I would just at certain moment there were people over there and they were staring at us, and I think I was asking questions of for how long, and I just invited them to come in. I was doubting that they are going to read on our lips standing under the rain, but they left. Okay, so to serious topics. I think Teresa and Juliane really were very accurate, and I would add one little point, is that I think Russians are calling Ukrainians fascists to allow themselves to be fascists. And this is a very important tool, because they were talking about Ukrainians as genociders to allow themselves to be genociders. And this is how propaganda works. Or information warfare. It's really very important so we understand its mechanism. You need to dehumanize the opponent in order to allow yourself to dehumanize yourself while you are acting with this opponent. When we understand that, we understand actually the nature of the Russian crimes and the nature how really they were acting in Bucha that Fabian was quoting, and in many places. I'm actually a philosopher who travels a lot in Ukraine, so I live in Ukraine. I go very often to the frontline areas. Last week I was in Kherson. If you know, this is a frontline city just 3 kilometers from the Russian troops. Russians are across the Dnieper River, and they shell the city all the time. And the first thing they establish in every occupied city is basically torture chambers. And people know where the torture chambers are. They are shown, look, there is a torture chamber in this place, to frighten people. So I think this element of fear is very, very important. And as I said, this story of because I mean the kind of the paradox, the tragic paradox of this reality today is that you can of course find Ukrainian fighters who will be, believing in some far-right theories. It is possible, you can find them everywhere. But then the question is, what is your actions? And the actions and judge by these actions. And actually, when you see the concentration camps, when you see torture chambers, I talked myself to several victims of the torture, and I mean, it's amazing how one of the persons I talked to said that he was tortured by electric current by the Russian soldiers. And then, do you know how Russian soldiers call the torture by electric current? They call it phone call to Putin. And I actually tested this. I heard it from one person. Then I asked one human rights lawyer and asked him who is actually acting, documenting Russian war crimes. And he said, yes, this is repetitive. This is not your single experience. And I'm keeping thinking, like, why would Russian soldier, by torturing a Ukrainian villager, say, we will now call to Putin, we will now make a phone call to Putin? I think just to legitimize his actions, like to say, you guys know that it's actually Putin who is above us, and we have this vertical legitimacy. So why I'm telling you this? Because in this war, you see this very clear pattern of cruelty and violence as normalized. Cruelty and violence not to achieve military goals, but to intimidate the people. So every night we have airstrikes every night, okay? Just to make clear for those who are probably not very not very close to Ukrainian reality, we have airstrikes every night, every day, every night, for 3 years, for 3 more years. And And very often they are not military targets at all around. So you're asking questions, so why you send a missile to a place which has no relation to military? You have no military purpose. And the answer is that I have in my mind is to intimidate, is to say that I'm capable of extreme violence, and therefore you should be afraid of me. I even invented a notion for that. The notion is thanatocracy, rule by death. So you kind of take a death as a management tool. You rule by saying that I own your death. Your death belongs to me. And by the way, this connects with Stalinism, because when I'm thinking what was these great purges of the 1930s, and people explain to me that, well, Stalin was very paranoidic and he was afraid of losing power. I don't really buy it. I think that the idea was that Stalin was showing to everybody that he owns your death. So not only he manages your life, but he owns your death, meaning he will decide when you will die. And I think this is very important intimidating factor for a human being. I mean, we are very afraid. We're afraid of dying, of course, but we are very afraid of giving our death to somebody. And probably it's okay that it's nature or God, but is it okay if it's somebody else? Physically, it makes us very frightening. But why? How you legitimize? How you tell your soldiers you're allowed to kill, you're allowed to make violence? I know you want to do that, because my deciphering of the Russian society, maybe I'm wrong, I'm not a Russia expert, but my deciphering is that there is a big element of violence in the Russian society, and therefore the model of your survival inside of the Russian society is that either you are subordinate to somebody who exerts violence on you, or you exert violence on others. So it's very vertical, it's not horizontal. You're not friends with others. You're basically competing who is up and who is down. And then when you're giving arms, and when you said, look, you cannot come back, we will kill you. It's a very typical practice of the Russian army. If you retreat, they will kill you. It was also very typical in the Red Army. But when you go there, you're allowed actually to kill. You're allowed to exert all this violence because it's like accumulated to you, so you actually can apply it to your victims. But of course, you cannot tell this exactly. You need to invent something, some fantasy, to justify it. And how you justify it, you dehumanize. And when you dehumanize people, you say, well, Ukrainians are fascists. And by that, you dehumanize. Because information and psychological war, its aim is, as I said, is not to deceive, it's a war. That means that basically its aim is to annihilate. But how do you annihilate? You either say your opponent doesn't exist, and this is one of the narratives of the Russian propaganda. Ukrainians do not exist, they are Russians. Okay, this is one narrative. But the second narrative is that Ukrainians probably exist, but they don't have a right to exist because they are Nazis and fascists. So I think it's very important to understand. And the next thing I would like to say about Russian propaganda, and very, very brief here. So we need to apply psychoanalysis to understand it. And some of my friends are doing that, like Peter Pomerantsev is doing that. I think he's one of the best, analysts right now on propaganda. Why? Because the goal of psychoanalysis, right, is to go inside your subconscious to understand where your trauma is and to try to heal this trauma. While the goal of the information and psychological war is to go very deep into your subconscious, find your trauma and aggravate your trauma, to make it even worse, to make it like so painful that you start acting like very aggressively, because you're no longer act as a rational human being. It's your unconscious which starts acting, right? And I don't know where it can lead us, but this is one of my recent ideas, is that actually information and psychological war is a reverse psychoanalysis. Is to go deep in your trauma and make it even worse. It's to go deep in your wound and not heal it, but to make it even more painful.
All right, so let me ask you one final question, and we'll move on to Q&A. It's a question for the three of you, really. So how do we counter propaganda, especially when we're talking about social media as well, or thinking about social media? It looks like purely engaging with it or responding with the facts doesn't work. So what do we do?
I would be very rich if I had an answer to that question, I think. I don't know if any of you wants to go first. I mean, I don't have a clear general solution for all. I think I can only speak for myself, which is, I mean, there have been very few things in the last years on which I've changed my mind or which I've been surprised. So I've been surprised by seeing that people that are completely reasonable otherwise believe in something that's obviously incongruent or silly. And so one thing that I'm sort of attuned to is detecting congruencies. Like, this doesn't sound right. People didn't used to believe these things, or people would not say the same thing if they were in this position, like replace Ukraine by Greece and replace Russia by Turkey. You wouldn't say that with those kinds of excuses. But this is only like an individual heuristic, like how to go about and try to find things from different sources. I mean, this is very banal, but try to read different sources. But like detecting congruences and try to think for yourself about things that you can be critical about. I think that's one way of resisting, propaganda. Let's put it like that. Okay.
I think I answered this question both as a historian and as a German. And it came to me when you spoke about Stalinism. In the end, we have to think about the recipients of propaganda, of why do people react to propaganda? Because in itself, it's very hard to even make a distinctive line between information transfer and propaganda. So it's like, what effect does it have? And I would say in the Russian case, it has a lot to do with trauma. In the end, the trauma of the Soviet traumas, and especially the trauma of the Second World War, has never been properly addressed, including the trauma of perpetratorship as well as victimhood. And it leaves people incredibly vulnerable to propaganda, because propaganda makes them feel better for a while. And I think that something we haven't talked about as much is that all this propaganda has an effect, of course, on Russian society as well. Stalinism, it's interesting, there are two debates. One of them is atomization of society. That's the Hannah Arendt analysis of totalitarianism. But also Stalinism mobilized. Stalinism created an incredibly mobilized society because there were enemies. The enemies changed. There were kulaks, then there were enemies of the people, then there were invaders, then there were cosmopolitans, then there were Jews. But having an enemy mobilizes, and it plasters over the trauma of one's own victimization. And I'm now somebody working on perestroika, which is this brief window when trauma was addressed in the Soviet case. And one can see the opportunities being missed, because in the end, the truly difficult traumas, the ones whose cover-up is propaganda, were state institutionalized pillars of society, especially the trauma surrounding the end of the Second World War, were left untouched. And for example, the Soviet army never had to confront the role of violence, indiscriminate violence in its victory, just as then in Afghanistan the role was never addressed. And of course other nations do that too. I don't want to say that it's only the Soviet Russian army, but it basically missed that chance to complicate its role to victory, to violence, to war, and as such basically allowed for a repetition of war trauma again and again, and this is what we're seeing now.
Yeah, of course I don't have replies either, like the final replies, but my several words will be, the first is, sorry, reality. I mean, we all are products of the 1960s. I mean, these people, like these guys, Foucault, Derrida, were actually my intellectual fathers and mothers. And therefore, I'm now thinking how wrong they were and trying to rethink them. Okay, they were right in many aspects, but actually, but it's a long debate. Reality exists, and this is my full conviction. And the thing that makes me really believe that reality exists is death. And death is real. Death is not a metaphor. And during the war, you just face it very often. And it doesn't sound, should not sound very macabre, because death, when you face death, you actually, your immediate reaction is to confront life to it. So Ukraine is now full of this experience, how you actually stress on life and beautiful experience and culture and poetry and everything. And I think, I mean, every society more or less reacts in the same way. So it's not only about Ukrainians. And because when you see the finitude of your existence, the unexpected finitude and mortality, this makes you even probably feel stronger. So I'm very worried about these ideas that are becoming very popular in the United States, that we are actually living in simulated reality. I think this becomes very dangerous, and this is another aspect of this virtuality coming over reality and saying I'm the real thing. I think the sense of reality is very important, physical reality, and therefore what we do in Ukraine, we actually travel a lot. We go to the frontline cities, we go to the frontline villages, and we invite foreigners to come. Of course, I understand it's very courageous to come. But those who come to our places, we help them to feel this reality, because when you feel this reality of creative people continuing to write poetry, making music in Kharkiv or Kherson, this actually makes you believe more in humans. So this is the first point, reality. So it doesn't mean that reality is simple and we simply can get access to it. So, of course, people will say, but all the truth is relative, etc. And my response is that, no, truth is not relative. It's just complex. It has so many aspects, and our life is just journey through these so many aspects. It doesn't mean that somebody has this truth and somebody has this truth. It's probably the connection between different aspects of truth. The second thing is trauma, indeed. I mean, I think that instead of, pushing against some people's traumas, we need to try to understand it. My understanding of America is that, I mean, of course, Trumpism is crazy, all this, etc. But the problem of the other side is just not to address these traumas that Trump voters had, not to address it timely, and just to dismiss it as craziness and all this, I think it's very dangerous. We are really in our information bubbles, and it's important to understand how painful the world is and how painful other people's experience is, and maybe to open up to this experience. And the third problem, and I don't know how to solve it, but I clearly see this problem, is that people are overwhelmed with information. People are tired of information. So we cannot reply to propaganda through more information. We should start probably with less information, but with another type of information. Probably the information that just doesn't give us this, the short elements of it, but probably gives us more deeper understanding. I don't know. But the fact that people are so much tired of overproduction of information that they will reject you as another producer of information is very, very likely to happen. So, and we need to be aware of that as well.
I have a follow-up actually on the two of you now. Hello? Can you hear me? So this is gone. And this, does it work? Closer? Knocked out? Okay. Now and louder. Okay, so Yes, reality exists. I mean, I don't know if all of you know this. We just had, was it last week? Last week, a total blackout in the whole Iberian Peninsula, both Portugal and Spain. And it was very bad. There were people who died. People who needed their things to breathe in hospitals or at home. People were trapped in trains and had heart attacks, etc. But all of us, and it was also interesting to see the reaction of teenagers who are addicted to their phones, like, what do I do now? And I was really happy that my daughter doesn't have a phone yet, and she just has this little reading light for a book so that she was okay. She was like, perfect, that's what I wanted to read the whole day. And so, but now about addressing your last point that Volodymyr was raising. So one thing is, once you are in this position that we are in right now, but there are being elections across Europe in different places, and in various countries we're seeing various kinds of far-right parties coming, and some, I'm not even sure it's right to call them far-right, people who just say anything because they haven't been in power and they can just promise whatever, and you can blame others for any kinds of things as well. You have various kinds of extremism. And I think that there are things that not as informers, not our role as informers that matters, but I think that there are important things for people who are in government and people who are in positions of authority. So there have been many things that, well, left or center left or maybe moderate parties have failed to address lots of things. Some of them are legitimate concerns that people had, right? People have had, there were legitimate concerns during the pandemic. In Spain, children were forbidden to leave the house for 2 months. Insane. Why? Right? You had people in Sweden reaching different conclusions. Why can't we discuss what they're doing in Sweden? Do I have to lose my social media accounts if I ask why aren't children under 15 allowed to go to school? So there are lots of things. Just the possibility of asking that was treated as, oh, we cannot discuss this, otherwise we don't know what people will do. So there was a lack of trust from governments on populations, something that apparently the Swedes did a bit better. They were asked people to be reasonable and to keep their distance, and children were allowed to go to school, which is good for their mental health, apart from for education. But there have been other things in terms of failures to address genuine concerns that populations have, that opens up the door for people who they're not going to solve them, but they can say they will, and they can highlight, like the Yellow Jacket people did. You can just highlight, look, we have reasons for being angry. Oh, look at this is completely failed society. We should come and replace them, right? So there are ways in which I think we're slowly walking, partly because we're sort of too concerned. Well, there are things that you cannot discuss. There are things problems that cannot be raised, and we should listen to. Before it's too late, we should listen to people who have different views, who have different concerns, take people's complaints seriously. But these would be recommendations for governments in case any of them would bother to listen to philosophers, which I doubt. But I think that is an important point. Like, take people's genuine concerns seriously. Don't treat them as fascists just for raising a question, which is what some left-wing parties that I have in mind tend to do instead of giving up solutions. Okay, thank you.
I also have a just very short brief follow-up, and it's to do with the information overload. And I think my lifespan really kind of fits very neatly in what one would call the information society. So I remember the first Gulf War with CNN suddenly exploding and the minute-by-minute or second-by-second news scene. And I have a sense we are at the end of this. We are at the end of this particular trajectory because we have come into cul-de-sac, or maybe just at the natural end. And it's interesting that the history, I would say, the methodology that's most on the rise is the history of emotions. And I think it fits in with sort of psychotherapy and a general psychoanalytical emphasis. We are living in an emotional age, or an age of affect. And I think it's on the affect we have to think about, why do people like propaganda and what can one offer instead? I think I agree. On the information front, I've done so much information the last 2 years, and I don't know if I even converted one person to anything.
Great, thank you so much. This was fascinating, and now we're going to open for some questions from the audience. So There will be a microphone going around. Please keep your questions short and on topic.
I
will see you. Yes, please.
I hesitate to ask this question because it opens the door to that terrible whataboutism, and I don't want in any way to trivialize Putin's invasion of Ukraine and terrors there. But if this panel were held 24 years ago, and considering Operation Enduring Freedom, where George W. Bush, U.S. state, mobilized a coalition of the willing, and they invaded a country far away from the U.S., they did not use torture, they used enhanced interrogation techniques. And how would, and I asked the question, so how we can look at this, the central concept of propaganda and shaping narratives in times of war. So how would you compare and contrast Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine and Operation Enduring Freedom?
Anyone?
So note that one of the things that involved, the torture bits, was a redefinition, a perversion of the meaning of torture. Like they literally said, no, this is not cruel and unusual punishment. This is enhanced interrogation techniques. It's not torture. No, this is fine. It's fine.
I don't really have a comparison. I think comparison of these kind of things are actually usually pretty useless. But I have a historical trajectory. And I think what is interesting is that I was doing my Abitur at the time, and I had a history teacher who challenged us, said, the Gulf War hasn't actually happened. How do you know it happened? And because all we saw on television was these green little arrows and then things exploding. While of course he was provocative, and I don't know what he really thought, but I later thought it was the beginning of, even though we suddenly had CNN and all this minute-by-minute information, it actually became less and less real somehow, the way of how it was portrayed to us. And I think it was the beginning of this sort of idea that somehow what we see in the news isn't all real. It was the very shy beginnings, but I think it contributed to that. So I think in that sense it is relative insofar as it started a global kind of different relationship between information media and audience, by first going hyper informative and then actually becoming hyper distrustful. I do actually think, and this is why I'm against these comparisons, there are many differences. If you look at the sheer number of victims, if you look at, where Iraq is today, it's an independent state, Ukraine is under threat, etc. I do actually think it is whataboutism, also because it's a different era. It's 30 years ago. United States had about, 10 different governments since then. With Putin, we have a relative close continuity from 2000 onwards, and in fact, wars on the way, which all are very similar, and Ukraine is only the latest. So I always urge people to keep these stories separate, because they are happening in separate spheres.
Anyone else?
My name is Oksana Stavro. I'm a lawyer and book author, and I just want to make a remark. So if we are talking about how we can resist the propaganda, the first and very simple step is not to use the narratives, the propaganda narratives of your enemies. The language, words, terms are very important and very powerful instrument of the propaganda, and the first instrument of the propaganda. So the major and the first narrative of this of the current Russia's war against Ukraine is the term Ukraine war, which was used in the introduction of this discussion. So this is a completely inappropriate term which ignores the perspective of the victims. It also suggests in some way the responsibility of the attacked country for the war, because if we are talking about Ukraine war, who is responsible? Okay, Ukraine is responsible, and it lets the aggressor, the real responsible, unmentioned. So it's a very imperialistic, Eurocentric attitude to name the war after the victim. So my my urge to you, forget this term. English language has a lot of possibilities to name the war. It's Russia's war against Ukraine. It's a Russian-Ukrainian war. It's Russia's war of aggression. So please let us resist the propaganda in this kind. Thank you.
I would react to this. I actually totally agree, and I try to fight against this Ukraine war for a long time. It doesn't work, but I think we need to fight against it. And you rightly pointed out that it's actually not only about Ukraine. Like we just talked about Iraq war, the French speak about Algerian war, whatever. It's a pattern, and it's a thing to reflect upon. I wouldn't go to that far that the concept Ukraine war is already kind of Russian propaganda. I think it's not, but I think we need to be very careful with these concepts, and we need to urge our friends to try to avoid it, because I usually give the example that the 1st September 1939 is not called Poland War, okay? And 1968 is not called Czechoslovakia War, okay? So we kind of need to understand it a little bit, but there is this broader concept, this broader problem that sometimes the imperial powers, when they invade others, it's called by the name of the invaded country. So it's Russia's war. It's Russia's war against Ukraine, it's Russia's war against Georgia, it's Russia's war against Syria, it's Russia's war against Chechnya. It's all Russia's wars,
Well, Levan.
Thank you, first of all, for a very interesting talk. I had two questions, but after Fabio's comment, to keep it short, I'm gonna just ask one. So my question is a bit provocative, because first of all, I don't believe the opinion that I'm going to present, but I'm just interested in what you think about it, because I think in general it's worth discussing some kind of skepticism about propaganda that might exist in literature and in in our everyday lives among people. So this skepticism questions the role of propaganda and its effectiveness, and I'm sure that most of the people here assume the serious role of the propaganda. That's why we talk about this. But this skepticism exists, and it says that actually propaganda cannot really add anything to already existent deep-seated beliefs or attitudes among some society or the nation, their habits, their ways of being, their effective dispositions, and so on. And there are some examples from history where propaganda, despite the fact of governments putting much resources in producing it, could not really do anything. It was unsuccessful. And of course it might have some different causes, but I'm interested, what do you have to say about this? And especially this can be an urgent question and not only a theoretical one, because I've been reading yesterday department in European Union, some representative of a counter-propaganda department, or I'm not sure how it is called. They were saying that it's really, really hard to convince governments to give us money to put in this department which fights against propaganda. So I think this skepticism exists, and so what do you have to say about that? Thank you.
Oh, you want to go first? Okay, excellent question. I'm actually working with my co-authors of the effectiveness of propaganda. We're working on a second paper called The Effectiveness of Propaganda. And there what we do is to address, so there's this book by Hugo Mercier called Not Born Yesterday, where he has a chapter precisely on what you've been saying. And he partly goes to work by other historians, if I'm not mistaken, to show that actually Nazi propaganda was not as effective as we tend to assume nowadays. Like it's not as if majority of Germans didn't actually believe, but my view on this is that the problem is not whether you actually change everybody's minds. You know? So sometimes, mostly in philosophy of language, in recent years, people seem to assume that, oh, if you just hear someone say something hateful, then you're spreading, just by hearing it, you're contaminated in some way, you're persuaded just by hearing these words being said. And it's not true. Like I hear people saying hateful things all the time, and I'm not persuaded by them. And why should I assume that other people do the same thing? So I think that the effectiveness isn't just about changing opinions. It's about something else that I think you were saying, that Volodymyr was saying in the beginning, about what you want to is to get people to act in certain ways. And you might get that by manipulating actions rather than, well, you just go along because if you don't, well, then you lose your job. Or maybe your children will not get a promotion, or maybe you don't know if you'll get a doctor appointment. So there are lots of things that, even though you're not persuaded, so your attitudes haven't actually changed, or your dispositions haven't changed, but you just go along with the actions because it's, well, more convenient and safer for you to agree. And so that's one important issue, and thanks for bringing that up, that we should be aware that there are reasons to be skeptical, because it's not just all about, like, people don't just all succumb to agreeing with propaganda. There's a lot of it that is just people going, when certain actors get into power, there are ways for them to get people to go along and to sort of to mobilize or to act in a certain way. That's the ultimate goal of the propagandists, is to get people to act in a certain way, whatever they think.
So my reply would be that propaganda is not as efficient as people tend to think, but it's still very efficient. If you make propaganda, and again, I'm not really fond of the word propaganda, as I said, right? But let's use, if you make propaganda in the initial sense of the word propaganda, like to bring some narrative that you want to impose on others. Like, I have a narrative and I want to impose this narrative on you, you will fail. And basically, it was known for a long time ago. I just evoked psychoanalysis, but look, one of the inventors of the propaganda theory was Bernays, who was his relative. And one of my favorite theories of the question of propaganda was Jacques Ellul. And it was 1960s. Everything you need to know, basically, is already there, before the social networks, before everything. Because if you want just the narrative transfer, you will fail. If you want to tell the story about yourself, you will fail. The good propagandist is actually telling the story about you. So if I am a good propagandist, I need to learn about you. I need to learn about your traumas, about your joys, about your pains, and manipulate them. So it's basically political marketing or information marketing. And the problem is that we do have more and more tools for people in big tech, for people in governments to kind of analyze us from this way, like what exact joys or pains this particular group of people can have. So let me take when Russians come to Ukraine and say Russia is great, they will fail. When Russia comes to Ukraine and says Ukraine sucks, sorry to say that, they might succeed. If they come to Ukraine and say your government is corrupt and you're failing this war because of your government, they will succeed in many aspects. Why? Because they know that Ukrainians are very anarchic. We don't tend to trust the government. Every of our taxi drivers is a good president than the president. So we are like that. So you need to exploit this anarchic trend, and they're doing it very well at some aspects. In some aspects, they're doing it very bad because they're actually losing the propaganda war, but they understand our pains and the cracks that they can actually use. So to your colleagues who are willing to find, money to support the anti-propaganda, well, I would say that they need to try, because we were very frustrated with the EU when the EU was actually saying no, that Russian propaganda doesn't exist, because it was still in this mode of thought that Russia uses information in the peace terms and not in the war terms. You need to be aware that somebody is waging a war against you, information war, and if they do not succeed now, they will probably succeed later, because they learn. They learn very fast, and they learn what are the pains in your society. So propaganda is always about aggravating the traumas, aggravating the pains, and the pains are real. And as soon as they understand what your pain is, they will be able to pour a lot of money to aggravate your pain. So it's like anti-pill, anti-medicine. They aggravate your pain. So I think it can be very efficient, but it doesn't work unless this initial pain is there. So again, the reality is there, and then the question is what should you do with this reality?
Again, historically, of course, propaganda is often understood actually not as a form of reception, but it's a form of telling something about the person who makes the propaganda, and of course they betray their own fears and their own worries in the propaganda they put out. I mean, I have two examples. I've never worked actually, on the effectiveness of propaganda as a historical subject, but in my research I've come across surprising moments where I realized when propaganda worked, and it's never one piece, it's not one story, one thing, it's a sort of long-ranging conversation between the propagandist and the audience. But my latest big work was actually a history of Soviet hippies, and I spent 10 years interviewing people from the subculture who were mostly very anti-Soviet, defined themselves as non-Soviet people. That was the defining marker. And what was interesting, at what points in their stories and in their narratives they touched on Soviet propaganda items and agreed. So they completely rejected the party, they rejected communism, they rejected leadership. However, they did not reject patriotism and the cult of the Great Fatherland War. And of course, there are many reasons of why that is so. So they were pacifists, they called themselves pacifists, but they were for an anti-fascist war. They would have supported an anti-fascist war. And in fact, I had the kind of ultimate proof then when war broke out in 2014. Very few of my Russian hippie correspondents felt any kind of pacifism, but most of them felt a strong feeling of Crimea is ours and we are patriots. So that particularly propaganda item had a success because, of course, that was something which you encountered from the cradle to the end, but also it served an effective need. And again, I come back to the importance of actually looking at the affect and emotions rather than the actual information content. The other one is, and then I just taught a class here at CEU on the 1990s. And I had actually a wide variety of people from the post-Soviet space in the class, which is always interesting. And what came out loud and clearly is there are two ways of looking at the 1990s in the post-socialist space. One of them is ultimately a story of difficulty but success. Nation building, identity building, culture building. The other one is one of what's called the lichie, the sort of bad, dark 90s, wild, chaotic, without limits, immoral. That's the story Putin is telling again and again and again. And Russia had the hardest time to tell themselves a success story of the 1990s. And that is ultimately the biggest difference right now between Russia and all of the other post-Soviet states, because all of the other post-Soviet states managed to find some sort of success story. In the end, they all went through similar experience of devaluation, economic decline, identity crisis, divisions, sometimes war, and yet it's the narrative that counts for the action. And, you know, it's not 100%, and not all Russians think that the 90s were just a decline in humiliation, and not all Ukrainians think it was a success story. But broadly speaking, the way of what you tell about yourself, and that is very much influenced to what you're exposed. And that propaganda basically does this exposure. And of course, in the case of Russia, we not only have propaganda, we have repression, because we have an active repression of a different narrative. And of course, one could say, yes, in today's world, you can get all sorts of narratives. But if you look at the film output, the popular culture output of about the 1990s, about this period of transformation, that is the overwhelming message of we have been humiliated, we have been victimized, and somehow there is a bad force. It could be the West, it could be Soros, it could be that is fighting against us. And that is different to the more positive stories in the rest of the post-Soviet space. So I think sometimes propaganda does work. It's not always predictable in what ways it will. And maybe that is also the chance.
Just a few words. It's very interesting what you're saying about Russian hippies, because I think we are going to the core of why Russia attacked Ukraine. Not because they think they won the Second World War, but because they think they lost the Cold War. So the defeat, the internalized defeat, and the willing to revenge is one of these, leading mechanisms. And therefore you have hippies who think that their life is defeat. Like people believed in perestroika, in Gorbachev, in rock and roll, and it was the defeat because it led to defeat of Russia in their minds. But it's very interesting. The hippie monarchist is very interesting.
Any other questions?
Yes. Hello. My name is Anna. Thank you so much for such fruitful discussion. Currently, I'm working on social bots as mobilizers of pro-state narratives within the bottom-up legitimation, and I definitely got the notes for my new chapter. Honestly, my question, and I think maybe the perspective to this discussion is to see, when we talk about Russia and the propaganda there, we see from the, as a homogeneous perceptions of really centralized perceptions of propaganda, how it works, how it's developed, and what is the pro-state narratives there. But I'm currently thinking of national republics and the ethnically non-Russians, and how to what extent the propaganda shapes their perceptions of war, and what is the cause of their war, of their participation. Because when we see the mobilization rates within Russia, across Russia, we see the lots of mobilizations coming from Siberia, coming from Berat. All the minorities are mobilized to the war. And I think I'm remembering the notes of Karamurza in Paris. There was he saying that non-Russian Russians are more prone to kill because they're not a part of Slavic culture, or do not share language, do not share the culture, or looks. I know that it sounds racist, but still is also in the note of dehumanization, and it's quite of interesting, how the propaganda and the perception, even though within Russia, happens. And I'm really interested how this perception of understanding of trauma and response to trauma could also shape the situation within Russian society, which has really diverse, multicultural essence, at least sense of it tries to keep. So yeah, that's my question. And yeah.
I will just quickly react. I think it's a very, very, very good point, and I think we need to talk about it. I mean, this war is genocidal against Ukrainians, but it's genocidal against the national minorities in Russia, and it's a very important because I know what you're talking about. I know that how many people actually the majority of Ukrainians who lived through Russian occupation in around Kiev Oblast, when we talked about Russian army, whom actually you met, they were calling Buryats, but in Buryats in a very generalized name, okay? And this is the way how they conceptualize it, but it's clear that the national minorities are used in this war as a tool of imperial attack. And this happens all the time in the Russian history. And Ukrainians were also used in this way in other wars. And I think one of the key boost effect for Ukrainian national movement was the First World War, when Ukrainians suddenly, not suddenly of course, but realized that we are used by the imperial power in fight in the imperial wars. And we are used in multiple imperial powers because there were also Habsburgs. And we were looking at each other in the front line and why we should do that. And I'm always talking to Indians, like people in India, that look, we have a shared story because you have the same story. The Indian national movement, one is the way how I see it, is also one of the products of the First World War, right? So how British Empire forced Indians to fight in their imperial army. So I really think that it is time for national minorities in Russia to ask this question: why? Why we should do that? In the name of what? And this is this should be a starting point of national movements.
I just have a remark about the Karamurza speech, which really was quite something. It's another example of the success of propaganda in a certain way in unexpected places. Here's somebody who went to prison because he was anti-Putin. He is against the war, and yet he comes up with a terminology which basically is straight out of imperialist textbook. And completely falls for this myth of the Slavic Brotherhood, which really this war has discredited in the last 3 years thoroughly. In terms of, the non-ethnic Russians in Russia, it's a very interesting question, and as you probably know, one of the theories political scientists have, that one of the ends of this war could be indeed a further breaking apart of the Russian Federation. Insofar as the war is putting stress on that narrative of unity, which Putin has managed in his, I don't know how many years in power now, already 25, to impose. But it's a very curious thing already in Soviet times that the Soviet Union drove anti-imperialist narrative as its propaganda item, and however at the same time an imperialist policy and privileging an ethnic Russian or Russian cultural narrative. And these tensions, of course, in times of pressure like now, these tensions become very much apparent. And in many ways I would like to hear what you think. Do you think is the future of the non-ethnic Russians in the Russian Federation under the conditions now and the pressures these communities face? And it's very interesting, I think, just again coming out of my research on perestroika, one of the most active perestroika groups and in the 1990s was the Soldier Mothers. And the Soldier Mothers' head was a woman from Buryatia who was a Buddhist. And she created this whole movement that really was one of the few spearheads of questioning the ideology of the Soviet army, and not only the existence of the Soviet army, but the whole ideology of violence, which of course goes much deeper than just violence against other nations, but the violence of within the army, the Dedovshchina, the hazing that is institutionalized and causes victims even in peace times. And I think it's very important to remember that this movement was spearheaded by somebody who came out of this outside the Russian cultural context, while of course, she was living in St. Petersburg, she was Russianized, she spoke Russian. That's the messy bit of empires, that we have no clear lines and everything is complex.
Yeah, there's a hand there. Oh, yep.
Hi. Is it working? Yes. Hi, my name is... okay. Hi, my name is Alexander. I also have a question. I'll try to make it kind of consequent to the last questions, because from what I hear, usually also as a political science, so I hear it all the time in the university, while people are talking about Russian propaganda, they're talking about the aggressive side of this. But, for example, you can sequence that really also Siberia, Buryatia, all of these regions, they're also very far away from Moscow. And it's the biggest idea of Russian propaganda that in Moscow no one should know that there is a war. No one should notice in the biggest cities that there is a war, something is wrong. And I feel like from what I hear, their propaganda is not about genocide, it's not about fascist Ukrainians, because no one really believes this in big cities. Like most well-educated people, because this is a big city, they're usually well-educated, and it's just absurd. But they believe in the isolationist, if I may say so, way of propaganda. And I thought about this when you, Juliane, Frau Fürst, mentioned the unresolved trauma of victimhood. And so I want to ask you about more like less aggressive side of propaganda, how it also works, like cultural propaganda in Europe, and the not soft, like isolationist propaganda inside of Russia, where people who were in the war in the beginning of the war and who were all along the way Navalnyists, they were pro-Navalny, they were anti-Putin, but a lot of people now say no one, like they don't want us, they won't help us, they all hate us, Putin is the only way we have. That's why we will not maybe actively support, but we will be apathetical to the war. We can't do anything. So is there any solution to this? What should Russians do in the future to prevent this in the beautiful future of Russia? And thank you. It was also very interesting. Sorry for taking your time. This is my last question.
Thank you. So I understand you're asking about the isolationist effects of yes, I mean, I think the greatest Russia is experiencing a great tragedy because this war is destructive for Ukraine, but it is absolutely destructive to Russian society as well. And I'm sitting here in a university where every student who is studying at this university is automatically an enemy of the Russian state by virtue of this being an undesired organization. I'm a member of the German Society for Eastern Europe. That is a terrorist organization, so every member is a terrorist. It's very hard to say what should people do. I mean, I think the word apathy you mentioned is very important as a historical understanding, because my interpretation of what Russian society's reaction is actually it's not rooted in the immediate phase of the transformation or the 30 years since Russian independence, but it's actually in a learned apathy that was learned in late socialism, where basically this idea that nothing one does changes anything, and that we concentrate on sitting on our daches and growing vegetables, and that already has been glorified by Tolstoy. That is a very studied reaction to the problem, and it is very hard from the outside to tell to people in repressive regimes, especially as repressive as they are now, as Putin's Russia, to go and rise up. I think, unfortunately, the points of rising from the street in Russia were missed. And frankly, I think the best hope for Russia as a democratic state, as a society that will change and will confront its trauma, is unfortunately defeat. Because it will question this ever-recurring propaganda of that only strength makes us happy. And in many ways, if we look at what are the happiest nation in the world, Finland, according to research. But it varies between other very smaller Scandinavian nations. None of the big nations, none of the nations with a high emphasis on being great have ever been particularly happy. And I think maybe what all nations have to learn is that not being so great is maybe making nations happy. And I think for Russia this process is very important, but we know other nations who want to be great and are not very happy.
So, we have a joke in Ukraine, make Russia small again, but it's a joke that comes from my fellow philosopher, who is Georgian, Vakhtang Kibuladze. But look, I indeed think that greatness is a great problem, and And I agree with this idea of defeat, because basically defeats were all good for Russians. I mean, the defeats were good for Russia, victories were bad for Russia. So the moments in history when Russia won, the big wars, were actually the moments of big authoritarianism. Starting from Peter I, then the victory against Napoleon was disastrous for Russia. Then the victory of the Second World War was a conservation of Stalinism, etc., etc. What was good for Russia was the defeat in the Crimean War, liberation of the peasants, was the defeat in Russia-Japanese War, is the first parliament and the first constitution, is the defeat in the First World War, is the defeat in Afghanistan War, is the defeat in the Cold War. So this was the moments of when more liberal ideas penetrated into Russia, not for a very long time, but still they penetrated into Russia. And I think this kind of at least we should understand this narrative that is historically more or less correct. Probably there will be other historical events, but this is historically more or less correct. But when you said about isolationism, I just realized that this is probably the new global ideology right now. Because I tended to think that Russia currently doesn't really give anything to others, contrary to other periods of its history. Like, it had a very strong Enlightenment, fake Enlightenment ideology in the 18th century, which seduced lots of French philosophers. Then it had a kind of this orthodox nationalist ideology in the 19th century, which seduced some of the peoples in the Slavic world, in the Balkan world. Then it has the Marxism ideology, which seduced many people around the world, even if it faked Marxism. I really think that what Soviet Union built was actually the inverted Marxism, because Marxism is based upon the idea that power should belong to people who own the means of production, while Soviet communism was built upon the idea that power belongs to people who own the means of destruction, meaning the army, the KGB, etc., etc. So it's a very reverted idea, and I'm thinking what Russia gives now to the world, and I was thinking for quite a long time that it gives nothing. There is no universalist ideology that it gives, just anti-Westernism. But now I understand that this is precisely isolationism. So Russia teaches everybody to be isolationist. So now we have this virus going to the United States. We will have it probably to other societies too. So we are probably entering the world of big isolationisms, where everybody will proclaim themselves as separate civilization. You know, you have a bunch of 10 people, and they will say, "We are the separate civilization." We will have this trend, and how to fight against it? Look. Juliane mentioned the popularity of Huntington, but Russians took the idea of this separateness of civilization earlier. They took the idea during 1920s with people like the first Eurasianists, Prince Trubetskoy and others. But again, even that idea they took from the West. So ideas come from communication. I always joke, like, when you say the president of Russian Federation, which word is Russian? In the statement, the president of Russian Federation, no word is Russian, actually, because Russian comes from the Scandinavians, and the president and federation come from Latin. We're all the product of exchanges, of mixtures. And it was a big, good message of the 20th century. Now we're losing it. We're going into new isolationism, and I feel very bad about it, frankly speaking. And I feel that this virus will spread, and social networks help it a lot, because social networks don't act as exchange platforms, but act as information bubble platforms. I think we all understand it right now. So, I don't know. Maybe we should fight against this isolationism all over the world, understanding that we will probably live in the next decades in this new wave.
Can I just add one thing? Because I'm not sure it's just isolationism. So isolationism would be consistent with you being there, isolated from everything else around the world, and having absolutely no contact with others. But I think that there's an idea that you now also see in the current U.S. administration, is that your greatness is the humiliation of others. So it's not just you can't be isolated to humiliate others. So you have to exert, because you have nothing else to offer. So your greatness depends on making everybody else worse than you and crushing them in some ways, with perhaps a couple of exceptions of people who are willing to be your co-conspirators in taking advantage of the other people around the world.
Yeah, this is what we might call the negative sum game, because we think that there is a positive sum game, everybody wins. There is a zero sum game, one wins or the other loses. But there is a negative sum game when you create the game in which everybody will lose, but your task is to lose less than the other. And I think this logic is, again, it's very authoritarian logic. Yeah, it's the way how tyrannies work, and I'm really afraid that it's spreading. So we need to find the ways to stop it.
We are unfortunately out of time, but we can keep having this conversation over a glass of wine. There will be a reception behind this door.
Yes.
And so please, let's thank our speakers, Teresa, Juliane, and Volodymyr. Thank you all for coming.
This was an episode of a podcast, Thinking Dark Times, by UkraineWorld, an English language media outlet about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, president of PEN Ukraine, and chief editor of UkraineWorld. This episode is a recording of a public event held by Central European University in Vienna. The speakers of the event were Teresa Marques, a philosopher of language from Barcelona, Juliane Fürst, a historian and professor at Central European University, and myself, Volodymyr Yermolenko. It was moderated by Fabio Lampert, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Vienna. It was organized by the Knowledge in Crisis, a cluster of excellence supported by the Austrian Science Fund. Let me remind you that you can support the work of this podcast and the work of UkraineWorld. Even a small donation can make a significant difference for us. Your support is crucial as we rely on crowdfunding. You can support our work at patreon.com. You can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas in Ukraine, where we deliver aid to both soldiers and civilians. You can support these efforts through PayPal, and you will find the link in the description of this episode. Thank you very much for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.